The banquet hall of Veldoria Palace had never gone silent so fast. One moment 300 guests were laughing over their wine, the orchestra was mid-note, and the evening felt like every other royal gala. The next moment a chair scraped hard against marble, a woman's voice cracked through the air like a whip, and Prince Aldrich was already on his feet, his jaw tight, pointing toward the door. "Leave, now!" Nobody in that room breathed. Nobody moved, because what had just happened at that table was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice, made in front of the entire court, in front of the king's own family, in front of a girl who had done nothing but sit in the seat she was told was hers. This is the story of the night Duchess Myril refused to give up a chair, and the price she paid for it. To understand why that single moment detonated the way it did, you have to go back 3 hours, before the wine, before the music, before anyone knew that this dinner would be talked about in Veldoria for years. Princess Alara had not wanted to come. She was 26, newly married into the royal family, still learning which fork to use and which cousins actually liked her. Her husband, Prince Corvin, had reassured her all week. "It's just a dinner," he'd said. "Half the court, some allies from the northern provinces, nothing formal." He had not mentioned that his aunt, Duchess Myril, would also be attending. He had not mentioned it because he did not think it mattered. He was wrong. Duchess Myril was the king's older sister, a woman who had spent 4 decades assuming that royal blood came with royal privilege, and who had never quite forgiven her brother for marrying a commoner-born queen who had, in her words, diluted the line. She had tolerated that marriage for 30 years. She had not yet decided whether she would tolerate Alara, whose own family came from modest means, whose engagement to Corvin had been announced with far less fanfare than Myril believed a royal wedding deserved. Alara did not know any of this walking into the hall that evening. She only knew that the seating chart, printed and sealed by the palace steward that morning, placed her at the head table, 3rd seat from the king, a position of honor reserved for the newest member of the direct royal line. It was tradition. It was protocol. It was, on paper, not up for debate. Duchess Myril disagreed. She arrived 20 minutes after Alara had already taken her seat, sweeping into the hall in deep violet silk, rings on every finger, trailed by 2 ladies-in-waiting who seemed to exist solely to agree with her. She scanned the head table once. Her eyes landed on the empty seat beside her usual place, the seat that for the first time in 3 decades was not empty. It was occupied by Alara. "That's my seat," Myril said, not to Alara, to the room. Loud enough that the nearest 6 tables turned to look. The steward, a nervous young man named Tomas who had only held the post for 8 months, hurried over with the seating chart clutched to his chest. "Your Grace, the seating this evening was arranged by protocol office. Princess Alara's placement follows the standard order of precedence for—" "I know what it follows," Myril cut him off. "I am asking why a girl who has been part of this family for 4 months is sitting where I have sat for 30 years. Alara's hands had gone very still in her lap. She looked at Corvin, 2 seats down, deep in conversation with a northern lord and unaware that anything was wrong. She looked at the king, seated at the center of the table, who had not yet noticed the exchange happening 3 chairs away. She had 2 choices: say nothing and hope it passed, or stand up and give away the seat that protocol said was hers. She chose the 3rd option nobody expects from a new bride. She stayed exactly where she was, and she spoke quietly. "Duchess Myril, I'd be glad to have the steward look into an alternate arrangement for you. I don't want to cause any difficulty." It was, by any measure, a gracious response. It was also the wrong one because it gave Myril an opening. "An alternate arrangement," Myril repeated, her voice climbing. "As though I am the guest who needs accommodating. Do you understand where you are sitting, child? Do you understand what that seat represents?" "I understand it's assigned by precedence," Alara said, her composure fraying at the edges but not yet broken. "I'm not trying to take anything from you. You already have." The words landed hard, and this time heads turned all the way down the table. Corvin's conversation stopped mid-sentence. He looked up, confused, then alarmed, as he registered his wife's face, pale, jaw tight, eyes bright with the particular kind of humiliation that comes from being attacked in public and expected to smile through it. He started to rise. "Aunt Myril." "Sit down, Corvin, this doesn't concern you." She didn't even look at him. Her attention was entirely on Alara now, and something in her expression had shifted from irritation to something closer to cruelty. Let me explain something to the table, since apparently no one else will. This family has traditions, standards, and every so often, someone marries in who believes those standards don't apply to them because they've been handed a title and a chair. A few guests laughed, not many, but enough. Nervous laughter, the kind people produce when they don't know whether something is a joke or a crisis, and would rather be safe than sorry. That laughter was, in its own way, worse than the insult itself. Alara felt her face burn. She still did not stand. Something in her, stubbornness or dignity or simple refusal to be erased at her own family's dinner table, kept her rooted in that seat. "I'm not moving because I was told I don't deserve to sit here," she said, quiet but clear enough to carry. "If the king asks me to move, I will. Otherwise, I think this seat is mine tonight." The hall had gone very quiet by then. Even the orchestra, sensing the mood, had softened to something barely audible. Myaril's expression hardened into something colder. She reached down and in one sharp motion took hold of the back of Alara's chair. "Then perhaps you need help understanding." It was a small gesture, a hand on a chair, but in a room of 300 people watching a duchess try to physically move a princess out of her seat, it read as an act of open aggression. Several guests gasped audibly. A glass tipped somewhere and shattered on the floor, no one turning to look at it. That was the exact moment Prince Aldrich stood up. Aldrich was the king's younger brother, quieter than his siblings, known more for his patience than his temper. He had spent the whole exchange watching in silence, jaw tightening with every sentence Myaril spoke, hoping, the way people in families often do, that it would resolve itself before he had to intervene. The hand on the chair ended that hope. He didn't shout. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled, which somehow made it more frightening than if he had screamed. "Take your hand off that chair." Myaril turned, startled. "Aldrich, this is a family matter." It stopped being a family matter the moment you tried to drag a member of this family out of her seat in front of 300 witnesses. He was already moving around the table, and the 2 palace guards stationed near the entrance had begun walking forward, drawn by the sudden tension radiating through the hall. "You have humiliated her for 10 minutes, and I let it go because I hoped you would stop on your own. You didn't." "I am the king's sister." "And she," Aldrich said, pointing at Alara without looking away from Myaril, "is his son's wife. Which means every word you have said tonight was said to a member of this family, in front of guests from 4 provinces who will remember exactly what they saw here." The king, finally registering the full scope of what was happening, had risen from his seat at the center of the table, his own face unreadable but his silence heavier than any words could have been. He said nothing yet. He was watching his brother handle it, and everyone at that table understood that his silence was not neutrality, it was permission. Aldrich turned to the 2 approaching guards. "Escort the Duchess to her chambers. She will not be returning to this dinner." "You cannot be serious," Myaril said, her voice cracking now, disbelief chasing away her earlier certainty. "Over a chair." "Over a chair," Aldrich said, "and over 30 years of believing this family's rules only apply to everyone else. Leave, now." The 2 words hit the hall like a second glass shattering. Myaril looked to the king, waiting, hoping for him to intervene, to soften his brother's order, to remind everyone that she was still his sister. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply held her gaze until she understood that no rescue was coming. Her ladies-in-waiting rose uncertainly, unsure whether to follow. Myaril straightened her shoulders, gathered the last scraps of her composure, and walked from the hall with the guards a pace behind her, her violet silk trailing across the marble in a silence so complete that her footsteps echoed off the walls until the doors closed behind her. For a long moment, nobody at the head table spoke. Then Alara, who had sat through the entire confrontation without moving, felt Corvin's hand close gently over hers under the table. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have said something sooner." "You didn't need to," she said quietly. "Your uncle did." Aldrich returned to his seat as though nothing unusual had happened, though his hands, Alara noticed, were not quite steady as he reached for his wine. The king leaned toward his brother and said something too low for the rest of the table to hear. A thank you, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that some conversations were easier handled by someone who wasn't wearing the crown. The orchestra, after an uncertain pause, began to play again. Conversation slowly resumed around the hall, though in careful, lowered tones. the way people talk after witnessing something they know they'll be describing to friends for weeks. Alara sat through the rest of the dinner in the same seat she had occupied from the start. She did not touch her food for the first 10 minutes. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, hidden beneath the table, even as her face held the composed, polite expression she had been trained to wear since the day she married into this family. It was, she would later admit, the hardest 30 minutes of her life, not because of what had been said to her, but because of how many people had watched it happen and said nothing until someone with the authority to stop it finally did. Word of the incident spread through the palace before the dinner had even ended. By morning, it had reached the northern provinces, carried by the very guests who had watched it unfold. By the following week, it had become one of those stories told in hushed tones at other courts. The night a duchess tried to remove a princess from her seat, and a prince ended her evening with 2 words. Duchess Myril did not appear in public for nearly a month. When she finally did, at a smaller gathering, she offered Alara a stiff, formal apology in front of exactly 4 witnesses. A fraction of the audience who had seen the original offense, but enough to satisfy the king, who had quietly made it known that reconciliation, however small, would be expected. Alara accepted the apology with the same grace she had shown at the dinner table. She did not gloat. She did not bring it up again. But something in the way the court treated her afterward had shifted permanently. She was no longer simply the girl who married in. She was the woman who had sat still under public humiliation and let her dignity speak louder than her anger, and who had earned, in a single evening, the quiet respect of a family that did not give it easily. As for Prince Aldrich, he never spoke of the incident again, deflecting every attempt to bring it up with the same modest line. "I only said what needed saying." But those who had been in the hall that night remembered it differently. They remembered a man who chose, without hesitation, to stand for what was right over what was comfortable, even when the person he was standing against was his own sister. And somewhere in Veldoria Palace, the seating chart for royal dinners was quietly revised the following month, with a new note added in the margin, initialed by the king himself. Precedence, once set, is not to be challenged at the table. It was a small addition, but everyone who had been in that hall understood exactly what it meant and exactly why it was there.